Good afternoon. Welcome back to Cool Your Heels with Lillian Caldwell on AMFN247.com and Lillian's interviews with Passionate World Radio Network, the world in your hands. And now at 3 o'clock, we have our special guest, David Demino, who is with a government organization who has an organization that is trying to bring a cohesive way of having your kids protected from gun violence when they're in school. And since I always forget the name of the organization, I'm going to have David tell you what it is. Good afternoon, David. How are you doing?
Hey, good afternoon. Hi, how are you doing today? And thank you for having me.
I am delighted for having you because as I've spoke to you previously, I really believe that students need to know how to protect themselves from gun violence without resorting to carrying a physical presence of a gun themselves, or to have their teachers or superintendents carry weapons into school and then taught how to use them. I don't believe that is a sane way of protecting students from other people bearing weapons.
Well, that's a terrific place to start out at, but just one clarification for you. NBITA, which is the National Behavioral Intervention Team Association,
thank you.
Called NBITA, is a private nonprofit, not a government. So
okay.
It's work that's been done over the last decade by a group of people that got very interested in providing services to colleges and universities to begin with, and then extending out to K to 12. About dangerousness, violence, and threat assessment. So they've been in the business for a long time. And one of the things that you mentioned, gun violence is a huge issue in the United States today, and school shootings are a huge issue. And what we did, what the company did 10 years ago, was to found NBITA under the umbrella of another organization called NCERM, which deals with higher education risk management. But their area of expertise was to do assessment to find out where dangerousness or violence or threats might exist in colleges and then in K to 12 by systematically putting some things together to have teams of people be the eyes and ears of the community, if you will, and then to have that community report things into a team called usually a behavioral intervention team, which is called a BIT, or a care team, so that information comes in from a lot of vantage points, is looked at, and we'll talk a little bit more based on your questions about how that information is processed to then identify what level of threat might be on the table before it happens.
Why do you think that gun violence or knife violence, or even with bomb violence, got a hold in America to start out with?
Well, this is a personal comment here, but access to weaponry is a huge debate in this country, and who gets weapons, how they get weapons, and then, taking it a little bit further, when weapons are available, be it knife violence or gun violence, and predominantly in the United States it's gun violence, when people get upset, they get distraught, they get in arguments, you might involve alcohol or drug abuse or substance abuse issues. Everything that goes into the pot to make something, and let me backtrack, even the bullying that we have across the spectrum of ages today, people might tend to get upset and might redirect their anger through a permanent solution, which is not the way to resolve the issues clearly. So, I think access, that's a personal comment, but access is an issue. There's got to be proper vetting and there is proper licensing, but we know based on what we see that people have more access, and people have access that haven't been vetted. So, it is an issue. We are concerned about that kind of violence in school systems from K to 12 and in the higher education arena. But that's not the only thing. I mean, there are other things when people can become upset, and we could look at harm to self as one of them or harm to others. So we have the spectrum harm to others, which would lead to a level of hostility and violence, or harm to self that might be some mental health or behavioral health issues that would be along the lines of suicide. So we're trying to prevent, look at the full spectrum of what's going on in your school district or in your college, and then identify the people who might need help. The whole essence of NBITA is to get to the person, have an intervention, and hopefully have things work so that they can get the help they need in the community, and that person is left being safe. And there's a lot that goes on in there. We'll talk about a little bit of it today, but certainly people would be welcome to visit the NBITA website and take a look at the more fully comprehensive program and what it's about.
I would think that a lot of what the kids see, who then become adults, are influenced by how their behavior is going to be. Because I know I'm a 50s kid, and there certainly were a lot of weapons around after World War II and the conflict in Korea. Now, maybe not as many people own guns, but certainly a large majority did in the non-suburban areas. I mean, even when I was growing up in New York and Long Island, there were still farms there that people had firearms to keep the varmints out of the field or to keep people from trespassing. So does your organization also work with studying the behavior of why people do what they do in order to prevent?
Well, that's a good way of couching it, but yes, behavior, to get right to the point, behavior is really the preeminent thing that you want to look at. And the way the organization does that, and the training that we do through NBITA, and again, we'll talk about teams and who does that looking in a moment, but one of the key parts of what NBITA does in the three phases of threat assessment, essentially. The first is gathering data. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But the second is a rubric or an analysis of the data once it comes in. How do you rate on a scale, basically, what is the level of dangerousness? And then the third part is the intervention. So the part that you asked about, which is gathering data, that becomes critical in any of the circumstances you talked about, and we're most especially concerned in organizations and mostly in schools, K-12, and colleges and universities. But that doesn't mean that the same type of interventions can't be done in business and industry and other places. So the gathering data part is about getting the word out that we, especially in K-12, and they do it pretty well now in K-12, they have teams of people who are the eyes and ears of the community reporting back, trying to do interventions. What they're missing is sometimes what is the level of threat assessment versus the behavioral assessment, where someone's sent out for counseling or removed from school to get counseling. The next step is what's the level of threat. So in gathering the data, we have the community stakeholders, and we know this. We know that the eyes and the ears of communities are beholden to mostly the teachers or the faculty at the colleges and universities. They see the students every day. So we want them trained to look for behaviors that they think they should report in to a team of people, gathering data, putting it together, getting it organized. For example, if I'll use my name, if Dave has an issue in a classroom and then has an issue with the school resource officer, is that coming together to look at what's going on with Dave as far as emotional stability perhaps, or any kind of intervention that could be made? Or are they angry threats that are being cast out by Dave, and something potentially harmful could happen? So gathering data, and in doing this, Lillian, there's a lot of range here. I mean, obviously we're talking about a bit to do with gun violence today, but looking for things like behaviors like any talk around suicide, a student who had serious loss or grief in their life. I'll give you just a few of them. Maybe alcohol or drug abuse. If you see people talking to themselves or they're acting, and this happens in daily life when you go to the store, you go to the grocery store, you go to a ball game, you see people acting in maybe a different fashion, and your gut feeling tells you there's something wrong here. I don't know what it is. It's a miss. I'm going to stay away from it. Our premise is that you report that so somebody can do an intervention to start to take care of that. So those things are on the table. The other things which heighten it a little bit, anger and rage are built into the kind of scaling, if you will, yelling back at people, stalking people, and then we go a little further into hopelessness and social isolation. But what we do in what to report is we train people, lay people, they don't have to have a clinical degree or anything special, how to look for these things. They don't have to solve the problem. They just have to report the problem. And when they report the problem to that intervention team or that care team, the care team will look at the information coming in. So that's our premise, is to get information to a team of people that can keep their arms wrapped around what's going on in their school district or their college or university. That's the whole base part of it. The second part, which we could talk about in a moment, I'll let you get to another question, might be the analysis of what do we do when that information comes in.
Well, yeah, that would be my second question. The other one is that I find it hard to believe that people can, only let me rephrase it, a lot of this has been missed with people recently during the last several years, where there's been some kind of behavior, and for whatever the reason, nobody has caught on to it. Is it because they weren't trained to spot it, or was it because that their range of behavior was so undeterminable? Because a kid may exhibit those type of symptoms and be perfectly normal.
Correct. Much like when people have substance abuse issues, they're able to hide it from their job, their spouses, or significant others for a period of time because they're inward about it and nobody is really seeing it going on. But the answer to your question is both. Sometimes it's masked and it's not seen, but a lot of the times, and there's a term, it's a little more technical, but a lot of the times there's leakage in what people are doing, but people aren't picking up on the cues of what is happening. So we want people to be trained much better to be able to look at something and not just take it at face value, to ask the next question or go to step further. It's not unlike see something, say something. I know we have that national model, we look out for that kind of dangerousness nationally. But if you see something that's a little bit askew, that's different, that's changed in attendance, in grooming habits, in less talk in the classroom, and it's different than what the person was doing before, it means get a little more involved, maybe ask a question or two, and we go through the training and tell people how to kind of integrate that, not on a clinical level, not on a law enforcement level, but just to kind of connect and then report that in so that someone else can start to collect information. And when I say collect, I don't mean like we're doing surveillance on people and tagging them all the time, but to collect the information so that it's reported by a teacher or then maybe a custodian or then maybe a coach. So now you have kind of, different prongs coming in to say, okay, something's happening with Dave. It's a little askew. Let's talk about Dave and who's going to do the intervention. If that is in a K-12 level, usually there's a school counselor, there's a school psychologist, or somebody who's going to call the student in. At the college level, it could be a myriad of people. It could be the Dean of Student Affairs, the Vice President of Student Affairs. But the idea is to get a branch extended to say there's something going on here, and we want to get to the issue before it becomes what we would rate as severe or extreme, where someone might get hurt or actually decide to take their own life.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that too, where they want the authorities to kill them, so that what it is death. It's suicide by giving permission to the cops or something. And I find that very disturbing, more so when a teenager does it than an adult.
Well, absolutely, and that's a term we've become too familiar with, which is suicide by cop. and that is a horrible situation for all the parties involved. The person who's thinking they're going to die by being shot by law enforcement, and it's a terrible situation for law enforcement to be put on a scene where they actually have to kill someone because they are waiting to die by suicide by cop. But those things that go on in the background there, when people get to that level, whatever frustration, whatever they've reached, whatever the breaking point was, we want to get there before that happens. And often there are clues, and that's the leakage I talked about a little bit. There are clues and fractures in people's lives that people don't usually pick up on or aren't attuned enough to pick up on. And we want people to be more aware and think about these things that people can be going through with the stressors of life, if you will, or substance abuse issues or mental health issues. And I don't put them all in the same bowl, but all of them can be powerful in how people decide to take next steps about what they may or may not do in their life or to other people.
So what is the next step after you have people taking a look at around them and being aware, which is not what you're really talking about? Instead of being aware of your surroundings, you're being aware of people's behavior. And if they fall just a little bit outside that behavioral zone, which you generously give to teenagers, because teenagers are a behavioral zone in of themselves.
Right.
You then take what? You start assessing the information and determining whether or not this person is indeed a threat?
That is correct. You're right down the right road for that. The step after that becomes something that Dr. Brian Van Brunt developed a lot of years ago, which is a really significant piece of work, and it's called the NBITA Threat Assessment Tool, and there's some information on the website about that. But what the threat assessment tool does, basically, and it's a little more complex. It takes training to go through it, and we do these seminars, nationally. But what it does is it enables that group of people that we talked about. Let's say on a college level, you might have a dean, a conduct officer, a counselor, maybe a faculty member. For school K to 12, you might have the school counselor or school psychologist, maybe a vice principal or a principal, maybe a teacher, or even maybe the school nurse. And they would look at it, and we train people in the NBITA threat assessment tool to take a look at levels of distress, essentially. And the scale is broken down to two different sides. One is harm to self, and one is harm to others. And there's something that we call the D scale, which is about dysregulation and decompensation. And it's got very low level. It's a rank order from 1 to 9. And you methodically can go through what the circumstances are surrounding the person that you're going to be looking at and talking about. And you can look at the level of distress, the level of disturbance, and then maybe it heightens up to dysregulation or decompensation, which could be on the harm to self side, suicide, certainly suicidal thoughts, feelings, and parasuicidal actions. So 1 to 9 on the harm to self scale, and then the other side, which is what I think we're really talking about today. These are both important, but the harm to others, the 9 levels of hostility and violence start at level 1 and escalate to level 9, and it goes from things like hardened debate with faculty members or other students on campus, actions instead of words. You're starting to take action towards somebody and consider threats, or there might be an overt threat. When people start to develop that strategy of threat, if you will, and then kind of escalating up to the level 9, which is like, I'm going to take care of this issue my way. And if, without talking about a lot of it today, that's when we have mass shootings, unfortunately. That's plunging into the abyss, which is that person's the top of the scale and is going to do harm to others. So when we look at this inside of the scale, the risk rubric, we give detail about like what kind of disruption are we talking about, what are they doing, what are the actions, how much information do we have about the threat, how imminent is it. and it's a way of organizing the information coming in, and then you take the D scale, the threat assessment tool, and you have an outcome from that. What is the intervention going to be? Now, certainly, you know this just from watching the media. Sometimes it's just an immediate hot button item. A report comes in, somebody has a weapon, there's a lockdown that goes to 0 to 9 instantly, and that's when you have lockdowns and law enforcement's involved. But what you want to do is to catch these in the mild or moderate range, maybe going over to the elevated range to say, what can we do to intervene here? How can we bring the temperature down on what this person is experiencing? It's an organized way of doing that. I think we always did that, K to 12 and in colleges and universities, and I spent my career working at a state university. I think we always looked at what was going on, but we didn't have a proper way to organize it, and I think this, the BITA tool, which I got involved with them about 8 or 9 years ago, was really a nice way to organize how that team came together and how they were able to take a look at elevated, severe, or extreme risk that people might have. So the collection of the data, and then the rubric or the analysis applying the NBITA tool, threat assessment tool, to the situation, and then intervention is the third step, which is obviously, hopefully, could be a nice outcome in that we get the resources and intervene before something grows and becomes very destructive in terms of suicide or homicides.
So when you do the intervention, do you actually take the person or people who are involved and really try to help them assess or try to have them take a look at what they're doing and maybe admit that their actions are extreme and not acceptable by the general public?
Well, that's the goal, and you kind of put it into a good context, is to do an intervention, and we do that. We don't do that if it's a threat and it's law enforcement. That's obviously a different way. But what we would do at a college or university, or perhaps at a K-12 system, is have someone reach out to the student, bring them in, and say, look, we've got these reports, this is what's going on, you want to tell us a little bit about it, to try to get information from the student or the client, the student at the college, to then start to look at what's going on in their life and what can we do in terms of services, let's say. That could be external from the college or the school into the community, or it could be things like, you're frustrated by your financial aid package and your check didn't come on in time and you can't pay your rent and you're going to be homeless. Those things escalate for students quickly, and that might lead to depression, anxiety, and potential suicidal thoughts. So the idea is to put someone in place to say what's going on. And I think, and I hope, and I think most colleges do this and schools do that, they approach it with a person who is the most comfortable talking to that student. And let me give you an example. If we were concerned about a veteran on a college campus and his team met, we might reach out to our veterans advisor on campus and say, hey, do you know Dave? We got these things going on. Can you kind of call him in and talk to him? And the veterans advisor would call, and it'd be like, kind of, come in, I want to talk to you, there's some things going on. It could be the conduct officer, perhaps it could be the dean of student affairs, and it often is, just to say, hey, we know you're struggling with things, we've got these things going on. Sometimes students deny that. Sometimes their shoulders go down. They say, yeah, I'm under a lot of pressure, and then we could start to take a look at what kind of intervention do we do to remedy the situation, again, to bring the temperature down.
Is there any way that perhaps your organization can set up some kind of a hotline where these people can call up anonymously and do that instead of going through the physical action of actually threatening other people?
Yeah, you mean the person that you would be looking at that would be threatening?
Yeah, kind of like the suicide prevention line, only having something set up along those lines for somebody who feels that they're in a pressure cooker and they cannot handle something. Because I know it's very easy to blame others for your failures. And when you do that, you want to lash out and hurt somebody because other people have to hurt as much as you are hurting yourself.
Yeah, you're right, because the pain is so intense that that's a possibility. Now, In terms of suicide hotlines, we know that's prevalent all over the country. 1-800-TALK, 1-800-SUICIDE. We have a lot of numbers that people can call, and local numbers. Like in Connecticut, where I live, we have a 211 system instead of I always call 911, but 211 is also prepared to answer those questions about I'm thinking about dying or I took pills, whatever it might be. So, you raise a good question. Is there a hotline to do that? Not yet that I know of. I wrote a note here about what that could entail. But let me flip it a little bit, and there's a way the student, either K-12 or in a college or university, there's a way to report that in through these what we call care teams or BIT teams. And there's multiple ways to do that. You don't have to pick up the phone and call directly to the dean's office or the principal's office. You could do that. You could do the report online. There's multiple ways to get that information to a central point where they can start to look at the activity that's kind of surrounding the student and what's going on before it escalates to either harm to self or harm to others. But you raised an interesting question. I made a note about that.
Thank you, because I know that kids, especially K through 7th or 8th grade, let's face it, they're not adults yet. They're not even full-fledged teenagers. They're sort of in between in no man's land. And it's a technological society in which these kids are being brought up in, and it would make more sense to me to have something where they can identify and feel comfortable about reaching out in such a way without compromising themselves at the same time.
Right. You are absolutely on the right track. And for those students, we know that peer-to-peer connection is critical because they will talk to their friends, either in person, via social media. That's where it's happening. It's not happening. They're not talking generally to the teacher, to the coach, to the professor, to the financial aid officer at a college. They're peer-to-peer. So there's a lot of, and schools, I think, nationally do this well, K-12. They look at bullying, they look at peer stress, they create whatever they call the organization or club, K-12 or college, they create these, and I'll call them safe zones, which is a term that is used a lot, and it's used a lot in the LGBT community as well, where people can go and park their issue. And a lot of that has to do with students talking to students. But the educational part of it is to educate students to then take the information and do something with it. Because too many times I think we see, well, I saw this thing on social media, or I saw this thing, I saw this Snapchat thing, or I saw this text, but I didn't think anything of it. We want you to think something of it and say, hey, can I tell someone at home? Can I tell a parent? Can I tell somebody at the school? Could I get the resident advisor at the college or university to know about what Dave is saying or doing on social media? So that's the intervention part. I think absolutely right, that peer part of it, so they can have somewhere to park that stuff, and then what that person does with it is critical. So
either that or a place where the kids can actually say to somebody anonymously, somebody I know in my class, they acted strange, they said some really weird things, and while I don't take Dave seriously, somebody else who hears him might think Dave has a problem and that it should be looked at. Or somebody ought to bring him in to listen to what Dave has to say, because he's been, muttering under his breath now for a week, and it's a little bit uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, and sometimes, and especially as young adolescents, sometimes adults do it too, I guess, we're too myopic in that we're focused in on our friendship, our relationship, our social connection, so we're not going outside the boundaries to upset someone. And I think a lot of times people are uncomfortable, taking it the next step and saying, for example, if you said something to someone about me, Lillian, and said, Dave is, this is what's happening, he's mumbling or something going on, the fear of you losing me as a friend might stop you from doing that.
Yeah, that's a big thing in middle school.
Yeah, And the parallel I'll draw, and our NBITA does a lot of training in mental health and suicide prevention and postvention as well. But the parallel I'll draw is like when we do those kinds of trainings, we train people, lay people, just friends, colleagues, to be able to ask the question very directly: are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about dying by suicide? Not to say you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Or you're not thinking about anything dumb, are you? To be very direct. But here's the critical part, Lillian, in the trainings that we do, and many other organizations do very well as well, is to be able to take the yes answer and do something with it appropriately and not bury it. So what's the next step? To be comfortable to say, are you thinking about dying by suicide? Person says yes, and then having the next step to make the intervention referral connection to get help. But people are afraid to ask the question, and I'll tell you, I've been in the business about 40 years. People are afraid to ask the question because they're afraid of the answer, and they're afraid of the answer because they don't know what to do with it. If you have some training, and there's some 1-hour trainings around the country, there are 2-day trainings about these kinds of things. There's our trainings. If you know what to do with it, you're more comfortable asking the question. So we try to enlighten people to say, ask the question, whatever that might entail, and then there's a place to take it. You don't have to own it. You don't have to intervene. You don't have to take the person to the hospital. Here's what you do with the answer. And you get comfortable, so you're asked the question and you get the intervention.
So what can schools do to pick up on this information? I noticed that there's a guide that's been put out for schools. And here it is, the Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model. Is that a guidebook that is given to different school districts for them to handle it?
Yeah, and I think, are you talking about the recent one that was released by the Secret Service?
Yes.
Yeah, that just came out I think last week or the week before, and you probably glanced at it, but it's a readily available document. I would tell school systems, if they're listening to this, if parents are listening to it, PTAs, whoever, take a look at it and generally try to gauge, is your district or your college doing anything about this stuff? And I saw the document when it came out last week, and certainly, my colleague Brian Van Brunt was delighted to see that in the references, NBITA was mentioned as one of several references, not endorsed by the Secret Service, but as a place to go to get information about threat assessment. So I think that characterizes the work that they've done, the association, both NCURM and NBITA, over the last decade to kind of entrench themselves into, look, we're concerned about safety issues on campus and we can help you deal with it. So we were mentioning it, but the report itself is just magnificent, so people should read that.
Yeah, I have the press release in front of me saying the Secret Service endorses NBITA's approach to prevention of school violence. So, David, please tell everybody where they can find you on the World Wide Web and how to get in touch with you, because I really believe that it's important to know that there are organizations out there that are willing to work with schools and colleges to prevent this type of violence from escalating.
Absolutely, and I would give you a couple of ideas here. The first one would be to go to the NBITA, our general open website, and that's NBITA, NABITA.org, and that will give you all the information about what NBITA does, and it will talk about all the people that work with and for NBITA, including all the external consultants that they have. So that's a good start. For my information, people can look, can email me if they have a question. I'll be glad to get back to them, and that would be, my email address would be my first name, David, and then it would be David@daviddemino.com, and it's DAVIDDENINO, one word, Demino.com. So if they shot me an email, what I would do, if they had a concern about school district or school, whatever's going on, I would just take the information, I would get it back to our executive director, who is Brian, and the people that work at the home office, and have them connect with the agency or the school district to see what kinds of things they're interested in or what they would like to do.
I think you should put together, they have recently released what they call adult coloring books. And I think it would be interesting for Nevada to kind of create coloring books for kids on how to be aware of the surroundings in which they find themselves with their peer groups.
That's a great outside take on what could be happening. In fact, I was smiling as you were saying the coloring book part of it, because I do know of classes, and I taught in a clinical mental health program for counselors in a graduate program for a number of years, and had a colleague introduce coloring as part of the therapeutic process for counselors to relax, newly budding counselors, but also to introduce in their therapeutic approach. So absolutely, you're right on with that, Lillian. That's pretty cool. Because
I think also you can have it where kids can color the pictures of people, of what emotions and behavior is related to different types of colors. If you're passionate about something or upset, you're angry, so you're red. And if you have a cool approach, you're usually a darker color, like a black or something. And I would think it would be very interesting, because kids, especially before they hit high school, are very perceptive of the emotions of their fellow classmates.
I agree, and I said before, that peer-to-peer connection, they do know the temperature. You're absolutely correct. And I want to say, I think all the art psychotherapists in the country just are loving you right now for saying that. So.
Well, I just think it's a good idea, because I think this is so important. And some things were not introduced in the 50s and 60s because we didn't know as much then as we know now. We're a lot more sophisticated in our approach of handling violence among school kids. I mean, when I was growing up, bullying was accepted, because everybody got bullied, and if you didn't deal with it, you were a weakling.
Yep, and that's changed, and we want people to understand that that's changed, and that you're not weak in doing that there's strength in doing that. That's exactly right.
Absolutely. Good. So do you have any words of wisdom before we close down the program?
Well, I would tell people to be, and when you first contacted us, this was for parents, PTOs, PTAs, schools. If they have concerns about this, check the Demino website and then start to talk to the school officials about what they're doing on campus to manage these kinds of things. I think that, parents are clearly a big part of what happens both for college students as well as K-12. So just to look and see, and talk to their superintendents or their school boards about what's going on. Everybody's aware of it. Everybody's doing something. I think what we do as a tagline is put a very systematic way of introducing care or intervention teams and threat assessment for either K-12 or college. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much. And one final thought, you may want to think about the organization, and it's a bad time to do it, but at the same time, when something like this happens, see if whether or not your organization can be attached to the survivors or to the school districts that were hit with this violence, so they know they have a place to turn to so that it doesn't happen again.
Well, great idea, and there's the other part I talked to you about was the volunteer work I do with the Red Cross, and similarly, there's teams of medical and mental health people that go in after something has happened to help people deal with those circumstances, and there's lots of specialists around the country that do that, including. I worked both the Sandy Hook school shootings here in Connecticut and the Las Vegas shootings recently, and a big part of that are the state agencies and FBI victims assistance. And I see what you're saying. How do you come in and help people heal from that? And the bit is always growing, so I'll never say never to anything that could develop for us.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard what David had to say, and you can hear David's interview with Lillian Caldwell all over again at amfm247.com/Lillian Caldwell, at passionateworldradionetwork.com/Lillian Caldwell, facebook.com/PWR Network LLC, twitter.com/LLC, iTunes, PWR Network, so it's itunes.com/PWR Network LLC. And before we go away and stray, Freud had this to say in 1927, "The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest till it has gained a hearing." Thank you all very much for listening. And remember, please keep listening. Thank you.